as well as the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, have proven themselves to be among the most bitter anti-Semitic enemies of Israel. To address this complicated battleground, I am proud to present British barrister and one of the most eloquent voices for the Jewish people today, Natasha Hausdorff.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. What a privilege to be amongst so many of you, individuals and organizations that are fighting in this battle for truth, justice, and the equal treatment for the Jewish state of Israel. You, so many of you, are at the forefront of the battle against the United Nations and the use of international courts to weaponize international law against the only Jewish state. The United Nations has for many decades been a victim of the battle between the rule of law countries, Israel, the UK, the United States, those countries that view rule of law as a curtailment on government power. A battle between those states and those despots and dictatorships that in contrast view the rule of law and the use of law as a means of wielding power. And as increasingly we see this battle manipulating the law and international law in particular against Western interests, we have to understand that this is not just Israel's fight, but Israel is at the forefront of a fight against Western civilization as a whole. And nowhere do we see that more powerfully, more forcefully than in the international courts and tribunals, the ICJ and the ICC in particular. It's no accident that when Richard Heidemann interviewed Foreign Minister Gideon Saar, the first few questions were about this battle against Israel in the international arena, this abuse of law, this weaponization of law, and the inversion of key legal terms like occupation, ethnic cleansing, colonialism, apartheid, genocide. Let's just take a moment and understand what is being done to each of these terms. Because remember, what starts with the State of Israel will not end with the State of Israel. Ladies and gentlemen, where was there an occupation? Well, Jordan's occupation of East Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria, where Jews were ethnically cleansed from those territories. Where is the real apartheid? If you travel through Yehuda v'Shomron, or as some call it, the West Bank, there are big red signs that warn Israelis from entering Area A. They don't really mean Israelis, because we see Israeli Arabs going backwards and forwards. No, ladies and gentlemen, those areas are Judenrein. That is the real ethnic cleansing. That is the real apartheid. Colonialism? Look around you. Israel is the decolonization success story. My family lived under Ottoman rule and then British Mandate rule before establishing or re-establishing the Jewish state of Israel in 1948. And then we come to the term genocide. The inversion of this term. I don't just mean with respect to the acts of genocide and the Holocaust that gave rise to the term, that prompted Raphael Lemkin to coin this term, to provide legal terminology for those atrocities that were committed against the Jewish people. And only yesterday and the day before, in the March of the Living, we commemorated those lives that were lost and reaffirmed our commitment to never again. I don't just mean the Holocaust that gave rise to the term genocide, but those acts of genocide on the 7th of October that were again committed against Jews because they were Jews. The inversion of that term and the projection in each and every one of these instances, what was done to the Jewish people themselves are being accused of. And it is the law and international courts that are being weaponized for this purpose. I am truly privileged that over the last decade I have worked with phenomenal lawyers led by Jonathan Turner of UK Lawyers for Israel, and in partnership with so many organisations that are present here today, we have been moving the needle against these abuses of international law. We have been standing up, we have been making legal submissions that have been embraced by some legal academics and even by some judges of the International Court of Justice. Former Vice President Julia Sebutinde. Give her a round of applause. Her commitment to the rule of law, to real international law, and her continued calling out of the bias of those judges that were led by the previous president, Judge Salem, with his own vicious track record against the State of Israel. The very fact that that judge was not that the international community did not demand that judge recuse himself tells us everything that we need to know about where these institutions have gone. And that UK Lawyers for Israel have pointed out the abuse of facts at these institutions too. When Karim Khan's application for arrest warrants against the leaders of the only Jewish state were predicated entirely on false information, ladies and gentlemen, we proved that every phrase of every sentence of Karim Khan's application, which he made public, his public summary, every phrase of every sentence was false. That international courts and tribunals seek to rehabilitate themselves and their shocking reputations and failing to live up to the lofty ideals that they were founded with, that they seek to rehabilitate themselves by going after the Jewish state, this must end. And with your help, I believe that we can end it. This, ultimately, is the eighth front. The eighth front in this war that is being waged against Israel. Look at the extraordinary successes that the Jewish people, the IDF, the security forces, have managed to achieve in those 7 fronts. The 8th front, ladies and gentlemen, is winnable too. If we reaffirm our commitment to truth, justice, and real international law, and we don't shy away from expressing the importance of the Jewish tradition in upholding standards of morality, that the IDF leads the way as a light unto the nations. I went on the ground in Gaza in September with an international panel of legal and military experts who were all astounded at the lengths that Israel's army takes to prevent civilian casualties, going way above the requirements of international law. That is the story that JNS proudly tells. That is the story that we need to be supporting, that we should be shouting proudly and as loudly as possible. And with all of your help, I fully believe that the 8th front is just as winnable as Israel has shown the other 7 to be. Thank you so much.
Inaugural conference here in the heart of Jerusalem at the Waldorf Astoria. It's so nice to see you, Natasha.
It's wonderful to be here with you. Thank you.
Of course, our pleasure, our pleasure. Now, Natasha Hausdorff is a British barrister, and Speaker of International Law. You are affiliated with Six Pump Court Chambers in London and served as the legal director of the UK LFI Charitable Trust. You have clerked for the Chief Justice of the Israeli Supreme Court and was a fellow at Columbia Law School's National Security Law Program. It's so nice to have you here. Natasha, given your expertise in international law and experience with the Israeli Supreme Court and the UK LFI Charitable Trust, I'd love to hear your thoughts on some key legal challenges Israel faces today.
It's difficult to know where to start on that one, I'm afraid. But perhaps I can focus on the misinformation that surrounds the legal status of the territory.
Absolutely.
Because it strikes me that that is at the core of all of the legal attacks against Israel. Everything that we've seen at the ICJ in terms of the advisory opinion last year that called for the ethnic cleansing of Jews from East Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria. I mean, that was predicated on this notion that Israel's presence in the disputed territories is in some way illegal or constitutes occupation. And we have to be very clear about the proper application of international law, in particular customary international law, and the rule of uti possidetis juris at Israel's foundation on the 14th of May 1948. Because the equal application of international law is critical to the international legal system maintaining any credibility. You cannot have a general rule like uti possidetis iuris and then an exception for the Jewish state for no discernible reason.
For those at home, could you define it?
So this is a rule that developed to be able to provide stability and certainty and clean lines and to define newly emerging states' borders at their moment of independence. And the rule set out that the new state took on the pre-existing administrative lines of whatever unit preceded it. It evolved from emerging in the 19th century. It was applied in Asia and in Africa, and it's been applied to every state emerging from a mandate, just like Israel, in emerging after the British left from the British Mandate for Palestine. And the rule dictates that Israel took on the pre-existing administrative lines as its borders. It means that from 1949 to 1967, Jordan was in illegal occupation perhaps of these areas, although the notion of illegal occupation is a relatively new phenomenon.
Yes, it is.
But was in occupation of these areas, and Israel recovered this territory in 1967. It ultimately sits at the core of putting the lie to these accusations of occupation, of illegal settlements, and to this notion that Jews should not live in certain areas just because they are Jews, or, as the ICJ would have it, need to be ethnically cleansed.
That's it. Now, you also speak a lot in media. Is there something that you feel comes up a lot that you can define now or share with us that has been problematic and media speaks with such confidence in, according to international law, they're being held in prison against their will? Well, that's not how international law works. Can you get into that a bit?
So I'd say one of the big areas of misrepresentation over the last year and a half has been in terms of the laws of armed conflict. What is proportionality? What are you allowed to do when you are an army, a moral, law-abiding army like the IDF fighting a terrorist organization like ISIS, Hamas, Hezbollah, that uses human shields and that tries to use the laws of war against the armies that seek to uphold them. So one of the big misnomers, this idea that Israel is committing war crimes, and we're seeing that manifest itself in every development and every example, and in the images that are emerging from Gaza, which are truly horrific.
Yes.
I think it's important that we understand that the media reporting from Gaza has purely been, for the last year and a half, Hamas propaganda.
Yes, and it's also hearsay.
Well, nothing that is reported out of Gaza makes it into the international media without the approval of Hamas.
Correct.
They control the narrative. And actually, the absence of journalistic integrity in media across the board, not to acknowledge that, to acknowledge the restrictions in reporting that they have, and that they are only able to serve as a mouthpiece for an internationally prescribed terrorist organization, is truly deeply shocking, and it inevitably has very, very negative connotations to how the law is being represented alongside the facts in this scenario.
How do you think we can not change the narrative, but begin to have change and affect change within those who need it most?
So I think it's so important to call the media out on this, not just because it is stoking anti-Semitism around the world and it is inverting the narrative to such an extent that it is covering up the war against Western civilization that Israel is engaged in fighting, but also importantly because it is in the interest of ordinary Palestinian civilians who are suffering under Hamas and have been suffering under this terrorist state for 20 years, but increasingly through the military operations that Israel is forced to undertake. They need to be free of Hamas. They need to be free of terrorism, and they need to be free of indoctrination. And until the international community acknowledges its own complicity in this, then I don't see that situation changing. The indoctrination, the incentivization to terror, the quality of life of ordinary Palestinians, especially in the Gaza Strip, that hangs in the balance on what we do in terms of the media and policy in getting rid of Hamas and ensuring that there's a more positive future that we can build together without them.
Now, you gave me a few ideas in regards to college campuses. How can we apply international law to what students are screaming across college campus, to how they're protesting, demonstrating, saying free Gaza, but they don't know where free Gaza is coming from or any of those things, from the river to the sea, etc.?
So at the core of this is education. And actually it's one of the key missions of the UK LFI Charitable Trust that I've been very privileged to serve as legal director of for a number of years. emerged from the UK Lawyers for Israel Voluntary Association that works for the proper upholding of law, international law to Israel, to Israelis, and educating to push back on these false narratives. The use of these legal terms, occupation, ethnic cleansing, colonialism, apartheid, genocide,
Absolutely.
they've all been inverted to accuse the victims of these crimes or situations of perpetrating the very crimes that were committed against them. And the key to this across university campuses, for sure, and even high schools, is to make sure that the false narratives here and the inversion and the weaponization of these terms is pushed back against. I'm speaking a lot on university campuses to a mixture of students, but certainly those students that understand the realities of what it is that we're dealing with and that know in their kitchkas that we are on the right side of both the facts and the law. My main mission is to provide ammunition to them and confidence to be able to tackle these issues head on. Because when they do, I fundamentally believe that the truth will out here, and that the general realization that this is not just Israel's fight, that the weaponization of international law in this respect threatens all Western liberal causes around the world. I hope that that's going to at some point start to move the needle, but it does require everyone to get on board and to pick up the baton on this one.
Now, and then I'll touch upon as well social media. Social media is also a huge problem in spreading the false misinformation and wrongfully created narratives quickly across for students, for people of all ages. Anyway, we should more safely utilize social media to be able to share policy, etc.
So this is a really tricky one because of the absence of regulation. And whereas there may be methods of complaint against mainstream media misreporting matters, and that's bad enough, the social media arena is the Wild West. I am I'm relatively speaking, a newcomer to it. Happily, I'm not having to run my own platforms, but I think it's very important now that I do have a presence on Instagram, on X, to be able to disseminate some of the media interviews that I'm doing.
I myself have forwarded many of yours.
I'm very grateful for that.
And you know what producers have said to me? Wow, Ariella, is that really true? And I said, yeah, why else would I be showing it to you? So thank you.
So it seems to be working. And I think, look, I've been persuaded to engage with it. We are never going to have the numbers to be fighting on an equal playing field against those that are spreading misinformation. But again, it's an arena in which we have to engage. And I have had tremendous feedback from around the world, increasingly now having these social media presences of people engaging with my material, being convinced by it, deciding to look into matters in more detail, and actually changing their minds. And that to me is a real proof of concept.
And it feels good, right?
Oh, it feels fantastic.
It feels great. It feels great. I love that. I love when you're doing something and you go, aha, it worked.
It did.
It worked. Now, of the people here at the conference, what topic are you speaking on? When you're here, amongst whom is on your panel, can you give us a little bit of a taste?
So this afternoon there's going to be a panel on the international legal situation, and we're going to have contributions from professors, my own CEO from UK Lawyers for Israel, Jonathan Turner.
I would love to meet him.
So we are hopefully focusing on ways to coordinate, especially when it comes to international tribunals, submissions, amicus briefs. There is an incredibly strong community of organizations and individuals in this space, and it's really wonderful to come to a conference like this and to be able to communicate and coordinate and reconnect with many people that we've been working with for over a decade now. And then later on I will be addressing the plenary shortly before Gilad Erdan and then the Prime Minister. And my focus will be on the United Nations, on international courts and tribunals, and on the weaponization of international law and what we can do to combat it.
Wow. Well,